There is something hunting us in Alaska. More and more go missing in these wild parts. I've worked these trails for 31 years. I've covered ground from the Kenai to the Brooks Range, logged more backcountry hours than I can account for. And I have watched this wilderness take people in ways I understand and in ways I do not. The ones I understand don't keep me up at night. It's the others, the prepared ones, the experienced ones, the ones who did everything right and still didn't come back. Each time I got closer to an answer, things started turning very bizarre, enough to make one go insane.
What follows is an attempt to document that pattern, not to sensationalize it, not to draw conclusions that the evidence doesn't support, just to lay it out the way it exists on record and let it sit there, the way it has been sitting in NPS incident logs and missing persons databases, and the quiet institutional memory of search and rescue teams for decades. Some of what follows has a rational explanation. Some of it does not. The reader can decide where the line falls. The Alaska Triangle is not a conspiracy theory. It is a geographic designation that describes the region bounded by 3 points: Juneau in the southeast, Anchorage in the south-central, and Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, along the northern coast. Inside those 3 points lies roughly 1.5 million square miles of the most remote terrain on the North American continent. Dense boreal forest, craggy mountain ranges, glaciers the size of small countries, rivers that run grey with glacial silt and can rise 4 feet in an afternoon. There is no part of this region that is forgiving, and there is no part of it that has been fully mapped, fully walked, or fully understood. The statistics are documented and consistent. Since 1988, more than 16,000 people have disappeared inside the triangle. The missing persons rate per capita in Alaska runs at more than twice the national average, and the rate of people who are never found. No remains, no equipment, no identifiable trace is higher still. In any given year, somewhere between 500 and 2,000 people go missing in the state. Search and rescue teams conduct hundreds of missions annually and regularly return empty-handed. These are not disputed figures. They come from state public safety records and federal Park Service data. The most famous single disappearance in the Triangle's recorded history happened in October 1972, when a small private aircraft carrying United States House Majority Leader Hale Boggs vanished somewhere between Juneau and Anchorage. What followed was one of the largest search and rescue operations in American history. 50 civilian aircraft and 40 military craft spent more than a month combing a search grid exceeding 32,000 square miles, an area larger than the state of Maine. They found nothing, not the plane, not the crew, not a fragment of wreckage, not a fuel slick. Hale Boggs was never declared legally dead until 1973, when Congress formally accepted that he was simply gone. A sitting member of the United States government vanished into this wilderness, and the full weight of the American military could not produce a single piece of evidence. That fact alone deserves to sit with you for a moment. The terrain explanation is real, and it is not nothing. Alaska's glaciers are riddled with crevasses large enough to swallow a person whole. The rivers carry things for miles. The forest is dense enough in places that aerial search is essentially useless. These are legitimate factors. They account for a significant portion of what the numbers reflect. But terrain does not explain everything, and the cases that terrain cannot explain share a set of characteristics that are worth examining carefully. The disappearances inside the triangle are not randomly distributed across the landscape the way pure terrain-based attrition would predict. Certain corridors, certain drainages, certain elevation bands generate disappearances that repeat across decades regardless of season, regardless of weather, and regardless, and this is the part that demands attention, of the experience level of the person who went missing. Return to the same coordinates across 30 years of incident reports and you will find the same zones producing the same outcome. The wilderness does not take people randomly. Something about certain places makes them lethal in a way that the map does not reflect, and the official reports do not explain. There is one documented anomaly that adds another layer before going any further: magnetic compass declination. In parts of the Alaska Triangle, compasses deviate from true north by as much as 30 degrees. Over a 10-mile route in dense forest, a 30-degree error is fatal. You follow your compass faithfully, you make every decision correctly by the numbers, and you walk in a slow arc away from where you need to be without ever knowing it. This is geological, measurable, and real. But it raises a question that no geological survey has answered. Why do the zones with the highest compass anomalies overlap so precisely with the zones where people disappear and leave no trace at all? A disoriented hiker still leaves a body. A disoriented hiker still leaves equipment. The compass deviation explains the wrong direction. It does not explain the complete absence. When Alaska Native tradition speaks about what happens to people in the wilderness, the dominant culture has a tendency to listen politely and then look for the rational explanation behind the story. That tendency is worth examining, because the traditions in question are not vague superstition. They are specific. They describe specific behaviors, specific locations, and specific methods of taking people that have been passed down with the kind of precision that comes from generations of direct experience. The Tlingit people of southeastern Alaska have carried oral traditions about a creature called the Kushtaka for as long as their oral history extends. The Kushtaka is described as otter-like in its natural form, but its defining characteristic is its ability to shift, to assume the appearance of a person, sometimes a loved one, sometimes a stranger, sometimes just a shape glimpsed at the edge of the tree line that looks almost right, but not quite. It does not kill in the straightforward way a predator kills. It disorients. It leads. It draws people toward water, toward isolation, toward terrain where no one will find them. It mimics voices. It calls from just beyond what you can see, using sounds that are familiar enough to follow. The traditional response to a Kushtaka encounter is not to run. Running toward it is what it wants. The response is to make noise, fire, bells, anything that cuts through the mimicry, to keep your companions physically close, and above all, to never follow a sound or a figure that you cannot fully account for. These are not the instructions of a culture that is afraid of the dark. They are the instructions of a culture that learned over centuries of living in this terrain that something specific happens in specific places and that there are specific behaviors that change the outcome. Rangers who have spent careers in southeastern Alaska are aware of this tradition. Some of them, the ones who have worked these trails long enough to build their own private catalogue of things that don't fit any official category, do not dismiss it the way younger personnel tend to. They don't endorse it in any report, but they note, quietly, that certain areas carry reputations that predate Western settlement by centuries, and that those areas and the areas with the highest concentrations of unresolved disappearances have a way of being the same places. That is not a conclusion. It is an observation. But it is an observation that a significant number of experienced people in this field have made independently and arrived at in the same direction. The animal behavior pattern adds another layer. Guides and hunters working specific corridors in the triangle have noted independently and consistently across decades. game trails that simply stop in the middle of terrain where nothing visible would prevent wildlife from continuing. Bird nesting patterns that avoid certain ridgelines and drainages entirely. Hunting dogs, trained animals with a working relationship to this landscape that refuse to advance past a particular point regardless of command, regardless of what the handler can see ahead of them. Animals do not refuse terrain for no reason. They respond to things that are present and that they can perceive. What they are perceiving in these zones is not recorded in any official document, but the behavior is consistent. It clusters geographically, and it clusters in the same areas that produce the open case files. There have also been reported sounds, not universally, not in every incident, but consistently enough across separate accounts spanning different decades and different parts of the triangle to be notable. A low, rhythmic hum with no identifiable mechanical source. Vocalizations that witnesses describe as almost human, close enough to recognizable language to make you stop and listen, not close enough to understand. Reports of these sounds cluster in the same geographic zones as everything else. NPS incident logs contain entries referencing unusual auditory phenomena attributed to wind patterns and geological resonance. The attribution may be correct. It may also be the only available category for something that does not fit any other category in a government form. In May 2014, a woman named Sharon Buis vanished from a trail outside Juneau. She was not a casual hiker. She was a physical therapist who had lived in Juneau for a decade, a woman who had biked from Alaska to Canada, who had recently returned from an ice camping trip in Greenland. She knew cold environments. She knew remote terrain. She was, by any reasonable measure, the kind of person this wilderness does not take. Sharon was due to meet a friend at the Mount Roberts trailhead on the morning of May the 24th. She never arrived. Her car was found at the trailhead parking area. Her last confirmed location was a business in downtown Juneau the previous morning, where receipts placed her at approximately 9:30. The gap between that receipt and the moment her friend realized she wasn't coming is less than 24 hours. In that window, she traveled to the trailhead and entered the mountain. Search teams covered the trail thoroughly. Dogs, ground personnel, aerial sweeps. They found no remains, no equipment, no evidence of an animal attack, no blood, no disturbed ground, no scatter pattern consistent with any known predator, no evidence of a fall, no evidence of a medical event. The mountain returned nothing. Sharon Buis has never been found, and the case remains open with nothing in it that points toward any explanation at all.
When a case like that comes across my desk, I go through the checklist the same way I always do. Weather conditions, experience level, route difficulty, known hazards, and looking for the thing that explains it, because in 31 years, there has almost always been a thing. With Sharon Buis, there was no thing. I've looked at that file more than once. She knew what she was doing. The conditions were reasonable, the trail was known, and she is gone, and the mountain did not give us anything to work with. What I write in the file is that the investigation is ongoing, which is the language we use when we mean we don't know, and we've stopped expecting to find out.
2 years before Sharon Buis vanished from that Juneau trailhead, a 31-year-old German wilderness traveler named Thomas Seibold left a cabin on the Ambler River in northwestern Alaska, intending to hike approximately 30 miles across the Brooks Range to the village of Kobuk, where a plane was scheduled to fly him home to his young wife in Wisconsin. He was experienced. The route was demanding but not beyond his capability. He had a destination, a schedule, and the skills to execute the crossing. He never reached Kobuk. No remains have ever been found. No gear, no equipment. no indication of where the route broke down or at what point he stopped moving in the direction he intended. The Brooks Range in November is brutal. That is the rational explanation, and it may be entirely correct. But Thomas Seibold has been gone for more than 12 years, and the wilderness has returned nothing to confirm it. Not a boot, not a pack strap, not a single fragment of evidence that would allow anyone to close his file. He left a cabin and walked into the mountains, and everything after that is silence. 2 cases are not a pattern, but they share something that sits uncomfortably alongside everything else documented here. Both were experienced, both were prepared, both disappeared in areas with documented search coverage and left behind a forensic absence that terrain alone struggles to fully account for. A person who succumbs to exposure leaves a body. A person who falls into a river leaves equipment, disturbed ground, something. What both of these cases share with dozens of others in the Alaska Triangle's open files is a complete absence, as though the person passed a certain point and was simply removed from the landscape entirely.
There are things we talk about among ourselves that don't go into official reports, not because anyone is hiding them, because there's no reporting category for them and no way to write them in language that belongs in a factual incident report. Things like, do not enter that drainage after dark under any circumstances. Things like, if you hear something that sounds like a person calling for help from above the tree line where no person should be, do not go toward it. You do not write that in a report, but you pass it down because it is the kind of information that matters.
The permit system at Denali National Park requires every backcountry visitor to file a detailed itinerary before entering. The park knows exactly who went in, exactly when their permit expires, and exactly when they were due to return. When the expiration date passes and the person has not checked out, a search begins. Most of the time, the search resolves. Most of the time, there is a thing. Some permits are still technically open. The person went in. The permit expired. The search was conducted, and there is no record of that person coming out, no remains, no location that the search established. The permit sits in the open file. The case sits in the open file, and in the space where the explanation should be, there is nothing. Alaska also holds thousands of abandoned mine shafts from the gold rush era, the majority of them unmapped by any current survey. The ground beneath the Alaskan wilderness is hollow in ways that no surface map reflects. In places, the forest floor is a skin over a network of passages that have been there for a century, without documentation of what is inside them, or where they go, or what, if anything, has been using them. This is a documented fact about the physical landscape. What lives in that physical landscape? What has always lived in it, according to the people who have been here long enough to know, is a question that the official record has never asked directly. The shafts are real, the traditions are real, the open files are real. And in the zones where all 3 things overlap, the disappearance rate is higher, the recovery rate is lower, and the cases that remain open share a profile that experienced search and rescue personnel have begun in the informal conversations that never appear in any report to recognize on site.
I don't tell people not to go in. That is not my job, and it would be wrong even if it were. These mountains are public land. Most people come out the way they went in. What I tell people is to understand what they are walking into. File your itinerary with multiple contexts. Check your compass against your GPS before you leave the trailhead and note the variance. Pay attention to the wildlife, not just for your own safety, but because the animals in this terrain know things about certain areas that no trail map reflects. If the dogs don't want to go in, pay attention to that. if the birds stop, if the forest goes quiet in a way that doesn't feel like ordinary quiet, not peaceful but absent, like something cleared the space, keep moving. Do not investigate it. Do not stop to reason it out. Keep moving and put distance between yourself and whatever changed. I've processed backcountry permits for 31 years. Most of the time when someone doesn't come back, there's a reason I can find and write down and stand behind. Something I can account for in language that belongs in an incident report. But there are a few, not many, but a few, where I look at that permit and I look at the experience level, and I look at the conditions, and I look at everything the search team documented, and I genuinely cannot tell you what happened to them. Those are the ones I think about at the end of the season. Those are the ones that made me stop asking why the numbers in certain zones never go down, no matter how many resources go in, no matter how thoroughly the terrain gets covered. Something in those zones keeps the numbers where they are, has kept them there for as long as the records go back, probably longer. The mountains up here don't give back what they take. Most of the time that's just geography, most of the time, but I know that's not the full story. I know there is something out there we don't fully understand, perhaps never will.